Ancient cities relied on a secret weapon more vital than any army, the silent power of stored grain. This is the hidden history of granaries, the vast warehouse networks that fed millions and built the world's first empires. You will understand how control over a simple sack of grain shaped the rise and fall of entire civilizations, a story told through forgotten seals and ancient inventories. Why did some of these massive storage systems vanish without a trace, and what secrets were locked inside with a simple piece of clay? What do you believe is the true foundation of power in any society? That simple sack of grain, the silent power behind the throne, first needed a home. Long before kings and empires, our ancestors faced a monumental shift. They stopped chasing their food and started growing it. This was the Neolithic revolution, a quiet upheaval that changed everything. For the first time, people produced more than they could eat in a single season. This surplus, this miraculous extra, demanded a new invention, the granary. In the world's earliest towns, like ancient Jericho and the sprawling settlement of Çatalhöyük, we find the humble beginnings of this revolution. They were not grand buildings, but simple pits dug into the earth, carefully lined with plaster to keep moisture and pests out. Imagine the profound shift in thinking this represents. It was no longer just about what you could carry or consume today. It was about saving for a future you could not yet see. These plaster-lined pits were humanity's first declaration of war against famine, our initial attempt to wrest a little security from an unpredictable world. But these structures were far more than just storage. They became the bedrock of the community itself. With a reliable food supply, populations could grow. Not everyone had to farm. This surplus allowed for the first specialists, the potter who made the jars, the weaver who made the cloth, the builder who constructed the homes. The very concept of a city, a place where thousands live and work together, becomes impossible without this foundational technology. Archaeologists now see these simple granaries not just as containers, but as the true catalysts of civilization. They unlocked a new way of living, this deep-seated human drive to secure our next meal, to build a buffer against the unknown, started with a hole in the ground. But as communities grew into cities and cities into empires, the simple pit would no longer suffice. The challenge of control was about to begin. That simple hole in the ground would soon evolve into something magnificent. As cities swelled into empires, the challenge of feeding thousands demanded more than just pits. It required architectural genius. These were no longer mere storage spaces. They were sophisticated machines for preservation. In ancient Rome, vast warehouses known as horrea were marvels of practical engineering. Their floors were raised on sturdy pillars, creating a crucial air gap underneath. This clever design allowed air to circulate constantly, pulling moisture away from the precious grain and preventing the rot that could doom a city. Walk into one of these buildings, and you would be standing on a floor designed to breathe. Across the Mediterranean, the Egyptians tackled the same enemy, moisture, with different materials. Their massive state-controlled silos were lined with a special kind of plaster, mixed to be impermeable to water. This hydraulic plaster was a technological breakthrough, a physical barrier against decay. The very location of these granaries was a calculated decision. They were almost always built near rivers like the Nile or the Tiber for the simple, vital reason of easy transport. A barge loaded with grain was far more efficient than 1,000 carts. Yet, for all their convenience to the water, these warehouses were also strategically placed within the city walls. They were treasures that needed guarding, a physical manifestation of a society's deepest commitment to its own survival. This architectural ingenuity was not accidental. It was the hard-won result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, of trial and error in the relentless fight against spoilage and hunger. The design itself tells a silent story of foresight and control, but such a perfect, complex system required an equally sophisticated method of management. How could anyone possibly keep track of what was inside? That crucial question of control was answered by a simple, ingenious object, a piece of baked clay. The humble clay seal, known as a bulla, was the ancient world's master key to security and bureaucracy. Think of it as a barcode, a legal signature, and an anti-tamper tag all rolled into one. The process was beautifully straightforward. Once a sack of grain or the stopper of a storage jar was secured with a cord, a lump of wet clay was pressed over the knot. Into this soft clay, an official would press their unique seal, often carved from stone or metal. Once the clay hardened, that knot was locked. If the seal was broken upon delivery, it was immediate, undeniable evidence of tampering or theft. These seals were not blank. They bore the intricate insignias of pharaohs, the symbols of powerful merchants, or the marks of temple officials. Each impression created an auditable trail. A sack of grain was no longer just a sack of grain. It was now the responsibility of the merchant from Sippar, or the property of the temple of Ishtar, or tax grain destined for the pharaoh's central granary. This system transformed anonymous, bulk commodities into accountable assets. It was a revolutionary step in economic history, creating a chain of custody that stretched from the field to the city center. The intricate designs pressed into these clay lumps whisper secrets across millennia. A seal found far from its home city reveals ancient trade routes. A common symbol repeated on countless seals points to a centralized authority controlling vast supplies. This prompts a deeper question, one that echoes in the silent archives of broken clay. Who exactly held the authority to make that final, binding impression? Was it a state scribe, a temple priest, or a wealthy merchant? The answer is written in the designs themselves, a coded message about who truly held the keys to the city's survival. The authority to seal that grain was backed by a second, equally vital layer of control, the written word. Deep within the cool, shaded halls of a state granary, a scribe worked by the light of a small window. His tools were simple, a stylus and a damp clay tablet, but his task was monumental. With painstaking precision, he pressed wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface, recording every single measure of grain that moved through the warehouse. This was cuneiform, one of humanity's first writing systems, born from the necessity of accounting. In Egypt, another scribe used a reed pen and papyrus, writing in a swift, cursive script called hieratic. His scrolls were not works of philosophy or poetry, at least not yet. They were ledgers. These ancient documents detailed everything: the source of the grain. Was it tax payment from a northern village or tribute from a southern oasis? They noted its quality. Was it prime milling grain or better suited for animal feed? They recorded its intended distribution, whether for the army's rations, a temple offering, or to be sold in the public market. And crucially, they listed the names of every official involved, from the merchant who delivered it to the granary supervisor who accepted it. These tablets and scrolls formed the world's first centralized databases, a vast physical network of information that tracked the lifeblood of the empire. Without this written bureaucracy, the sheer scale of urban life would have collapsed into chaos. How could you feed 30,000 people in a city like or Memphis if you did not know what you had, where it was, or who was responsible for it? The scribe's pen was not merely a tool for record-keeping. It was as vital to the city's survival as the farmer's plow. This intellectual framework, this system of meticulous documentation, transformed random piles of grain into a managed, accountable resource. It reveals a profound truth that the power to feed a city was not just about storing grain, but about controlling information. And the people who held that information, the scribes and their masters, wielded a quiet authority that shaped the destiny of nations. That control over information granted a power far beyond simple bookkeeping. The meticulous records kept by scribes were not just for accuracy, they were the foundation of a political system. In the ancient world, the authority to feed a city was the ultimate source of power, and this authority was often cloaked in divine right. In Sumer, the temple was not just a place of worship, it was the central bank of grain. The high priest was the chief executive officer of a divine corporation, overseeing the collection, storage, and distribution of the community's entire food surplus. This was framed not as mere administration, but as a sacred duty to the gods. The people believed the gods themselves owned the land and its produce, and the priests were their earthly stewards. When a farmer delivered his portion to the temple granaries, he was making an offering. When a laborer received his daily ration of bread and beer, it was a divine gift. This system seamlessly wove religious faith into the very fabric of economic survival. In Egypt, this concept was taken to its absolute extreme. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was a living god, the sole intermediary between the people and the life-giving Nile. His control over the river's annual flood and the vast state granaries that stored its bounty was the central pillar of his legitimacy. Art and propaganda from the time constantly reinforced this idea. We see carvings of the pharaoh, towering and godlike, personally overseeing the grain harvest or distributing loaves of bread to grateful subjects. This imagery was a powerful message. It said that every meal, every full stomach, was a direct result of the pharaoh's divine grace. With this control, a ruler could accomplish extraordinary things. The grain taxed from farmers and stored in central warehouses paid for the armies that defended the borders. It fed the thousands of laborers who built the pyramids and the temples, monuments that further cemented the ruler's godlike status. It could be released during a famine to prevent unrest, a calculated act of benevolence that reinforced loyalty. But this system was a double-edged sword. The power to provide also meant the power to withhold. Access to food was a powerful lever for social control. Compliance with the state's demands, whether for labor or taxes, was guaranteed by the knowledge that your family's survival depended on the grain ration from the central granary. This political dimension forces us to look past the bricks and clay seals and see the human hierarchies they supported. The granary was never just a warehouse, it was the engine room of the state, a tool of statecraft that created a society of deep dependence. This centralized control created immense stability, but it also sowed the seeds for a profound vulnerability. What happened when this perfect system, for whatever reason, began to fail? The immense power of these centralized grain states makes the silence from the Indus Valley all the more baffling. Here was one of the ancient world's largest civilizations, with cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa boasting populations in the tens of thousands. They must have had a system to feed everyone, yet they left behind a puzzle that defies our basic understanding. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro stands a structure archaeologists call the Great Granary. It is a monumental building with a raised, ventilated platform, a design that seems perfectly logical for storing massive quantities of grain, but this is where the mystery deepens. Despite its familiar appearance, excavations have failed to find the one piece of evidence you would absolutely expect: the microscopic residues of grain itself. So if this was not a granary, what was it? Was it a vast warehouse for other goods, a great communal hall, or the headquarters for a completely different kind of administration? The building itself offers no easy answers, and this is compounded by another profound silence. The Indus Valley people had a written script with thousands of inscriptions found on seals and tablets, but to this day, no one has been able to decipher it. Their voices are completely lost to us. This means we have no royal decrees, no tax records, no temple inventories, nothing to tell us who was in charge or how this complex society was managed. The absence of grand palaces or massive temples next to these granary-like structures suggests something remarkable. Perhaps the Indus Valley civilization operated without the all-powerful god-kings or priestly rulers we see in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Instead of a top-down hierarchy, their control might have been more corporate, managed by a council of merchants or elders. Imagine a system where power was distributed, a form of early bureaucracy that was collective rather than autocratic. This challenges everything we think we know about how early civilizations managed their most vital resource. They built a sophisticated society that looks familiar on the surface, with its planned cities and advanced drainage, but whose internal logic remains fundamentally alien to us. With their script silent, we are forced to look for clues not in texts, but in the physical connections between these people, in the trade routes that wove this unique civilization together. These silent river highways were the true arteries of every ancient empire. A city like Memphis in Egypt or Uruk in Mesopotamia was not just built near a river, it was built by the river, its entire existence predicated on that constant, flowing connection. The geography itself dictated power. Moving heavy, bulky grain over land was a slow and brutally expensive process, limited by the strength of donkeys and the condition of rough dirt tracks. But a single wooden barge guided by the current and a square sail could carry the yield of entire fields, a floating mountain of food destined for the city's heart. This was a logistics chain engineered by nature and exploited by human ingenuity. Fleets of these cargo boats moved with the rhythm of the seasons. In Egypt, they traveled the Nile, collecting the tax grain from rural estates after the harvest. Their destination was often a massive granary complex like the Ramesseum in Thebes, a hub positioned right at the river's edge where the grain could be unloaded directly from the boat into the safety of storage. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates served the same purpose, connecting the fertile fields to granary hubs within mighty city walls. The strategic placement of these hubs was no accident. They clustered at the junctions of major waterways, at the points where canals built by thousands of laborers branched off to irrigate more land and facilitate even more transport. This minimized the dreaded overland journey to just a final, short distance. The efficiency of this entire system, from the farmer's field to the citizen's bread, placed a hard limit on the size of a city. A breakdown in this flow meant immediate famine and the instant unraveling of social order. This logistical web, however, created a new and immense vulnerability. The entire wealth of the state was now physically concentrated in these riverside hubs. A single granary complex might hold enough grain to feed the population for a year. This made them the most tempting targets for any rival kingdom, any invading army, or even any local rebel leader. The security of these hubs was not just about strong walls and guards, it was about information. If an official did not know exactly how much grain was in each granary, where it had come from, and who was accountable for it, the entire system was built on sand. The delicate, continuous flow of grain from countryside to city was what turned a geographical advantage into unshakable economic and political power. But that power was only as reliable as the clay tablets tracking it. A single day of fire and ash may have undone centuries of Minoan planning. On the island of Crete, the Minoans had built a civilization of unparalleled sophistication, a maritime empire whose wealth flowed from a network of coastal palaces and warehouses. These were not just storage buildings, they were the pulsating hearts of a redistributive economy. The palace at Knossos functioned like a corporate headquarters, collecting olive oil, wine, and grain from the surrounding countryside, storing it in vast magazines lined with enormous jars called pithoi, and then redistributing these goods to specialized craftspeople, sailors, and the population at large. Their entire society was a meticulously balanced machine, dependent on the sea for both trade and transport. Then the volcano on Horria, over 70 miles away, exploded with a force unimaginable. The eruption was one of the most violent in human history. It would have been followed by a tsunami, a wall of water racing across the Aegean Sea to smash directly into the northern coast of Crete. Picture those critical coastal hubs, the warehouses positioned for easy access to the sea, being utterly obliterated. The Minoan fleet, the wooden network that physically connected and supplied their world, would have been splintered beyond recognition. In an instant, the logistical chain was severed. The palaces might have still been standing, but their purpose was gone. The system of centralized collection and distribution, the very engine of their economy, seized up. How do you feed a population when your storage depots are washed away and the ships that move the food are at the bottom of the sea? This is the core of the historical mystery. Was the Minoan collapse solely the result of this external shock, a single bad day that no amount of planning could withstand, or were there already hidden cracks in their society? Some archaeologists point to evidence of palatial destruction on Crete that seems to predate the eruption, suggesting internal unrest, perhaps rebellions or rivalries between the palace centers themselves. The Thurian catastrophe may have been the final, decisive blow to a system already under strain. This ancient disaster forces us to ask a difficult question about resilience. It demonstrates the profound vulnerability of any civilization that concentrates its vital resources in a centralized, geographically exposed system. The Minoans mastered the sea, but in the end, it was the sea, weaponized by a distant volcano, that may have broken them. Their story is a haunting lesson in how quickly nature can rewrite the rules of human power. For the common laborer, the state granary was not a distant concept but the source of their daily bread. This system transformed the very nature of work and society. A worker shaping stones for a pyramid in Egypt or hauling bricks for a ziggurat in Mesopotamia was rarely paid in coins. Their wage was a daily ration of grain, measured out from the vast reserves of the state or temple warehouse. This was the foundational social contract of the ancient world, labor exchanged directly for sustenance. It created a society of profound interdependence, where the individual's survival was inextricably linked to the grand projects of the state. This relationship, however, was a double-edged sword. A worker's loyalty was ensured by the reliability of that ration. But what happened when the Nile's flood was too low or when a war disrupted the supply routes? The failure of that single grain delivery could cascade into catastrophe. A missed ration meant a hungry family, which led to discontent, then to protests at the granary gates, and potentially to the kind of civil unrest that could topple a dynasty. The entire social order was balanced on the fragile, continuous flow of grain from the central silos. That final, crucial step from stored grain to edible food often happened just next door. Attached to the large granary complexes were industrial-scale bakeries. Here, the grain was milled into flour, mixed into dough, and shaped into the loaves that were the true staple of the ancient diet. You can almost hear the constant, rhythmic grinding of millstones and smell the pervasive, earthy scent of baking bread. This was not a cottage industry, it was a state-run factory, converting the empire's most valuable stored asset into the fuel that powered its civilization. The rhythm of the city itself was set by this system. The workday began when the bakery ovens were lit. The market's activity pulsed with the distribution of bread and beer rations. The evening meal in a worker's home was a direct result of the granary's accounting and the bakery's efficiency. This was social engineering on a massive scale, a policy that deliberately shaped daily life by controlling the most basic human need. The distance between the towering granary and the humble hearth was surprisingly short, connected by a simple, powerful loaf of bread. That daily loaf of bread was protected by law, etched in stone for all to see. In ancient Babylon, the great king Hammurabi had his legal code carved onto towering stone pillars, and nestled within its 282 laws were specific, detailed rules for granaries and storage. This was a revolutionary leap. Grain management was no longer just a matter of local custom or a ruler's whim. It was now a matter of state-enforced law, creating a predictable framework for the entire economy. One law stated that if a man rented a granary from another and the granary proved to be defective, leading to a loss of the stored grain, the owner of that granary himself had to compensate the renter for the lost grain. Think about the profound implication of that. The law placed the burden of maintenance and structural integrity squarely on the owner, establishing a clear liability for negligence. It forced builders and owners to ensure their warehouses were sound, because a collapsed roof or a flooded floor was now a legal offense, not just bad luck. Another law dealt with the constant threat of theft. It declared that if a man stole grain from a granary, he was required to repay 30 times its value. But if he could not pay this immense fine, a punishment far more severe awaited him. This draconian penalty was a clear message. The security of the community's food supply was so vital that any breach would be met with overwhelming force. The code did not stop there. It even set standard rental rates for agricultural storage, creating price stability and preventing exploitation. By codifying these rules, Hammurabi was essentially creating the world's first known building codes and insurance policies for the food supply. He was demonstrating a sophisticated grasp of risk management, understanding that for commerce to flourish, people needed to trust that their property was safe and that contracts would be honored. This legal framework made large-scale storage a less risky venture, encouraging investment and trade. The very existence of such specific legislation shouts one thing across the centuries: the warehouse networks were the absolute bedrock of the Babylonian economy. Their security and proper management were deemed so critical to the state's survival that they required the full weight of written law. This set a powerful precedent, establishing a direct link between legal security and economic stability that would echo through the ages. Yet even the most rigid legal codes could not protect every storehouse from the slow march of time. Far from the bustling trade hubs of Babylon, in the stark desert landscape near the Dead Sea, a different kind of mystery was being buried. The Qumran community is world famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient religious texts discovered in nearby caves, but the ruins of their settlement tell another story, one of extensive storage. Archaeologists have uncovered rows of carefully made storage jars, grain silos dug into the earth, and a remarkably sophisticated network of channels and cisterns that captured precious rainwater. This practical infrastructure presents a profound puzzle. Was this the isolated retreat of the Essenes, a strict religious sect storing food and water for an imminent apocalyptic conflict, a fortress of faith against a corrupt world? Or does the evidence point to something else entirely? The same jars that might have held sacred scrolls could also have stored valuable balsam resin and dates from the lush plantations near Jericho, products that were highly prized across the Roman Empire. The presence of weights and measures and pottery styles linked to regional trade suggests this might have been a commercial outpost, a specialized center for processing and storing luxury goods. Perhaps the scrolls were simply the personal library of a wealthy family, stored for safekeeping, entirely separate from the settlement's main economic function. This is the core of the mystery. The site's extreme isolation speaks of a desire to withdraw from the world, yet its material remains a whisper of deep connections to it. The community's stored wealth was not just one thing, it was both spiritual and commercial, a duality that challenges our modern categories. For the people of Qumran, accumulating a surplus of food, water, and valuable goods may have served two overlapping purposes. It provided physical sustenance for a community waiting for the end of days, while also generating the economic capital needed to survive in the present. Their storage jars held both the seeds of daily survival and the potential for trade, revealing how the ancient mind saw no contradiction between preparing for God and engaging in commerce. This blurring of sacred and secular purposes shows that the impulse to store and secure wealth, whether in scrolls or in spices, was driven by the same fundamental human need to control an uncertain future. The Romans perfected this ancient art of storage into a precise instrument of state power. Their answer was the horrea, a network of state-owned warehouses that formed the logistical spine of the entire empire. These were not simple barns, they were fortresses of food, engineered with a sophistication that still impresses. Their walls were built from thick, fireproof brick and concrete. Inside, the floors were raised on countless pillars, creating a hidden void that allowed dry air to circulate constantly beneath the grain, an active defense against the rot that could spoil an entire province's shipment. The entrances were heavily guarded, not just by soldiers, but by complex locking mechanisms, turning each horrea into a vault. The scale of this operation was almost unimaginable. The Horria Galbi on the outskirts of Rome was not a single building but a vast complex, a city within a city dedicated solely to storage. Historians estimate it could hold enough grain, olive oil, and wine to feed the million-strong population of Rome for years. This was the physical heart of the annona, the public grain dole that provided free or subsidized grain to the citizens of Rome. But this was never just about charity or preventing famine. It was a brilliant and calculated political strategy. By guaranteeing the bread supply, the emperors purchased the loyalty, or at least the compliance, of the volatile urban masses. A full stomach in the city meant stability for the throne. This system of centralized depots also became the engine of Roman military expansion. A legion marching in Gaul or Britain could be supplied not from local farms, but from a horrea built in a strategic coastal town, its contents shipped across the known world. The efficiency of this supply chain allowed Rome to project power further and sustain it longer than any civilization before it. The Roman model, with its blend of architectural genius and bureaucratic precision, represents the absolute peak of ancient warehouse technology. It was a system of control so effective that its blueprint for power would be studied and feared for 1,000 years. Centuries after the Minoans vanished, their own palaces were occupied by a new militaristic power, the Mycenaean Greeks. And in the ashes of their final destruction, we find an answer carved in clay. At the burned palace of Pylos, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of clay tablets, baked hard and preserved by the very fire that ended the civilization. They are inscribed with a script called Linear B, a forgotten language that, once deciphered, revealed not epic poetry, but the dry, meticulous bookkeeping of a palatial economy. These tablets are a frozen moment in time, a complete inventory of the kingdom's wealth on the eve of its catastrophic collapse. They list staggering quantities of goods, thousands of gallons of olive oil, tons of grain, stores of spices like coriander and cumin, and vast supplies of linen and wool. Every single jar, every chariot wheel, every worker's ration was counted and recorded by an army of scribes. This was a command economy of breathtaking scale, all flowing through the palace's central storerooms. The mystery lies not in what they controlled, but in how. Was this a purely top-down system where the palace owned everything and everyone, directing all production and trade like a massive, controlling corporation? The tablets show the palace distributing raw materials like wool and flax to individual textile workers, who would then return a set amount of finished cloth, a classic piecework system. But does this mean the workers were independent artisans contracted by the palace, or were they effectively serfs, bound to the palace's service? The records are silent on this crucial distinction. They tell us what was recorded, but not the lived reality of the people outside the palace walls. Was there a vibrant private market operating in the shadow of this giant, a parallel economy the palace chose to ignore in its official records? We simply do not know. This ambiguity leads to the greatest question of all. Did the very perfection of this system seal its doom? When the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse arrived, when invaders attacked and trade routes disintegrated, a hyper-centralized system had no plan B. If every chariot wheel, every sack of grain, and every skilled craftsman was on a palace tablet, then the destruction of the palace itself meant the complete and instantaneous evaporation of the entire economic structure. There were no decentralized markets to fall back on, no independent merchants to keep goods moving. The loss was total. The knowledge of the linear B script itself died with the palace scribes, plunging Greece into a dark age. The Mycenaeans created a system of control so detailed and all-encompassing that it left no room for error, and when the shock came, the entire civilization shattered. Their story is a stark warning about the fragility of perfection and the hidden dangers of a system that records everything, yet understands very little about the human networks that truly sustain it. That intricate impression in the clay was far more than a security mark. It was a miniature self-portrait, a declaration of identity pressed into the very stuff of civilization. The stamps and cylinder seals used to authorize grain shipments were often exquisite works of art, carved from lapis lazuli, carnelian, and jasper. These were not simple tools, they were personal jewels worn on a cord around the neck or on a finger ring, a constant, tangible symbol of the owner's authority. An Egyptian official might use a scarab seal, its underside carved with his name and a prayer to the gods, the scarab beetle itself a potent symbol of rebirth and transformation. Every time he pressed that seal into the clay stopper of a grain jar, he was not just locking it, he was invoking divine protection for the contents and asserting his own place in a cosmic order. In Mesopotamia, a merchant would roll his cylindrical seal across the damp clay, leaving a continuous, detailed frieze. This tiny scene might show him being led before a god by a lesser deity, a public claim of divine favor and legitimacy. Another might depict a heroic myth, like Gilgamesh battling the bull of heaven, signaling the owner's strength and cultural sophistication. The choice of image was deeply personal and strategically public. A seal could announce your profession, showing you with a carpenter's tools or a scribe's stylus. It could proclaim your loyalty to a specific king by incorporating royal symbols. It could even trace your family lineage across generations, with motifs passed down like a heraldic crest. This transforms our understanding of that moment in the granary. The act of sealing becomes a ritual, a performance of status and identity that connects the practical task of securing food to the profound realms of faith, family, and power. The beauty and individuality of these objects force us to see ancient bureaucracy not as a cold, impersonal machine, but as a human system where even the most mundane transaction was an opportunity for personal expression and a reminder of the intricate social web that held the city together. The seal was a promise made not just by an office, but by a person with all the weight of their identity and their soul behind it. That same seal pressed into the clay was a promise against the sky's uncertainty. Ancient civilizations lived at the mercy of the climate, and their granary networks were the only shield they possessed. In Egypt, the entire calendar revolved around the Nile's flood. A perfect flood, neither too weak nor too strong, meant a bumper harvest that would overflow the state silos. This surplus was not for immediate consumption. It was a sacred reserve, a physical buffer saved for the inevitable year when the river did not rise high enough. The granaries transformed a volatile annual gamble into a predictable multi-year food supply. This system turned climate variability from an existential threat into a manageable risk. In Mesopotamia, the challenge was different but just as dire. Their rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were less predictable than the Nile, and salinization of the soil was a constant enemy. A series of good years allowed the central authorities in cities like to fill their warehouses to the rafters. This accumulated wealth was what financed their majestic ziggurats and powerful armies. But it was also their salvation when the rains failed in the northern plains or when a canal silted up, creating a local famine. The central granary could release its stores, feeding the population and maintaining order. This was the grand bargain of early statehood. The people gave their grain and labor to the central authority, and in return, that authority promised to save them from starvation. Yet this bargain had a breaking point. A single bad year could be weathered. 2 or 3 lean years would stretch the system to its absolute limit, but a prolonged, multi-generational climatic shift could shatter it completely. Around 4,200 years ago, a mega-drought known as the 4.2 kiloyear event gripped vast regions of the world. The archaeological evidence is stark and silent. In Mesopotamia, the great city of Akkad was abandoned, its fields buried by wind-blown dust. In the Indus Valley, the meticulously planned cities were slowly strangled as the monsoon patterns shifted and the rivers that fed them changed course. Their granaries, no matter how well managed, were designed for a climate that no longer existed. They were built to handle a few bad seasons, not a century of aridity. The grain they saved was eventually eaten, and when the reserves were gone, there was nothing left to replenish them. The people had no choice but to disperse, to abandon the urban centers and return to a simpler, more mobile way of life. The collapse was not always sudden, like an invasion, but often a slow, grinding exhaustion of resources. The layers of silt in a Mesopotamian city or the dust in an Egyptian silo tell a story of finality, a point where the system's resilience was simply overwhelmed. This cycle of accumulation and depletion is one of the most powerful rhythms in human history. It forces us to see these ancient warehouse networks not as static buildings, but as dynamic systems locked in a constant, delicate dance with the environment. Their success created the stability for civilization to flourish, but their ultimate failure reveals the profound vulnerability of any society that becomes too dependent on a stored past to survive an unpredictable future. Far to the south, another civilization faced an even more elemental challenge than storing grain. In the stark, rainless plains of Peru, the Nazca people looked not to silos but deep into the earth itself. Their survival depended on a miraculous invention, the Puquios. These were not simple wells, but complex underground aqueducts, spiraling tunnels carved down through the dry soil to tap into hidden aquifers. The system functioned like a subterranean lung, with cleverly designed ventilation shafts that used wind pressure to pull the precious groundwater through the tunnels and up to the surface. This was a revolutionary form of storage, a living warehouse that held not harvested grain, but the very resource needed to create it, water. The Puquios transformed the desert into a green oasis, feeding a complex society for centuries. Yet this practical marvel exists in the shadow of a far more famous mystery. Scratched across the vast desert floor above these tunnels are the immense Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs of spiders, hummingbirds, and geometric shapes so large they can only be seen from the sky. For decades, theories have swirled around their purpose, but the most compelling idea connects the lines directly to the water flowing silently beneath them. Could these giant figures have been a ritualistic map of the Puquios system below? Perhaps the lines and spirals marked the location of the aquifers, or served as a walking prayer for continued water flow, a desperate, beautiful plea to the gods for fertility etched into the very landscape they were trying to cultivate. This suggests a profound and unified worldview where technology and spirituality were inseparable. The Nazca did not just build a water system, they sanctified it. Their entire civilization was built on a different kind of warehouse network, one that stored potential rather than product. It challenges our entire definition of what an ancient storage system could be. They remind us that human ingenuity is not just about building containers, but about reimagining the very resources we seek to control. The granary was a fortress, its walls as thick as any palace and its entrance a choke point designed for control. These were not passive storehouses but active strongholds, protected by a garrison of state soldiers whose loyalty was beyond question. Their presence sent a clear message: the grain inside was worth more than gold, and the penalty for touching it was absolute. Access was ruthlessly limited. A single, heavy gate might be the only way in, overseen by a watch commander who checked every authorization. Inside, the design itself prevented mass theft. Grain was stored in separate, walled compartments, so that even if a guard was bribed, he could only grant entry to one small section of the total treasure. This physical security was just the first layer of a brilliant, multi-tiered defense. The true genius lay in the bureaucracy that tracked every movement. No single official held total power over the grain. The system was deliberately designed to require multiple people, each with their own seal and ledger. A scribe recorded the amount, a quartermaster verified the quality, and a warehouse supervisor applied his personal seal to the clay bulla locking the jar or sack. These men watched each other as closely as they watched the grain, because if a theft was discovered, all would be held accountable. This web of mutual suspicion was a powerful internal police force, making collusion between officials a dangerous and complex conspiracy. The law backed this system with terrifying force. Legal codes like Hammurabi's were explicit. Theft from a state granary was not a simple crime of hunger. It was an attack on the state itself, an act of treason punishable by death. In some cultures, the punishment was mutilation, a public and permanent reminder of the cost of violating the community's trust. This severity was not mere cruelty. It was a calculated deterrent for a crime that could trigger famine and topple a kingdom. The entire security apparatus, from the armed guard at the gate to the scribe's meticulous tablet, served one ultimate purpose: to make the cost of stealing the grain impossibly high, and the act of doing so nearly impossible to conceal. The strength of a city's walls meant little if the fortress at its heart, the granary, could be compromised from within. A surplus of grain was a form of stored energy that could be moved, measured, and multiplied. In the ancient world, this simple fact turned warehouses into the first financial institutions. The grain inside was not just food, it was capital. It was the primary currency that fueled entire economies long before the widespread use of coinage. A ruler's wealth was not counted in gold bars, but in the number of silos he controlled, their capacity a direct measure of his economic and political power. This stored surplus created the very possibility of taxation. A farmer's obligation to the state or the temple was not paid in cash, but in a portion of his harvest delivered directly to the central granary. This inflow of grain was the state's revenue, the fuel for its projects and its armies, but the system did not stop there. That same surplus became a trade good of immense value. A city like Babylon, with its granaries overflowing, could send fleets of barges down the Euphrates, trading thousands of bushels of grain for Lebanese cedar wood, Anatolian silver, or precious lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan. This transformed grain from a local subsistence item into an international commodity, a tool for acquiring luxury and power on a global scale. The most revolutionary step, however, was turning storage into a banking system. The temples and palaces, with their vast, secure warehouses, became the first lenders. A farmer needing seed for the next planting season, or a merchant needing capital for a trading voyage, could take out a loan not in money, but in grain from the temple's reserves. The debt would be repaid after the harvest with interest. This practice of grain loans with interest is recorded on some of the oldest cuneiform tablets in existence. It meant that the granary was no longer a static repository. It was a dynamic engine for generating more wealth, the ability to store value across seasons, and then to loan that value out to create more value was a financial revolution. It allowed for investment, for risk-taking, and for economic planning on a scale never before possible. This concentration of capital in the hands of temple and palace elites inevitably widened the gap between the rich and the poor. The farmer who borrowed grain in a lean year and could not repay his debt might have to surrender his land or even his family into servitude. The granary, therefore, was not just an engine of commerce, it was also a machine for social stratification, solidifying the power of a ruling class whose authority was rooted in their control over the most basic resource of all. The true product of the granary was not just bread, but economic inequality itself. 6,000 years ago, on the sun-scorched islands of Malta, a society without metal or written language raised temples from colossal stone. The sprawling complexes of Haga Kim and Mnadra are aligned with celestial precision, their altars and courtyards speaking of a deep spiritual life. Yet within these sacred spaces, tucked behind massive walls, lie strange corbelled chambers. Their ceilings are expertly built, layer upon layer of stone overlapping to form a domed, waterproof vault. This specific design is a global hallmark of one thing: secure storage. The profound mystery is not just what was stored in these chambers, but why it was kept inside a temple. Could the temple itself have been the island's central granary, the beating economic heart of a theocratic state? Imagine a farmer bringing his offering of barley not to a royal tax collector, but to a priest at the temple gateway. The grain would be measured and then carried into the dark, cool chamber, a physical offering to the gods that also happened to be the community's insurance against famine. In this worldview, there would have been no separation between the spiritual and the practical. To store the surplus was a sacred act of preserving the gods' generosity, and to redistribute it during lean times was a divine duty. The priest was both a holy intermediary and a warehouse manager. His authority derived from his connection to the deities who controlled the fertility of the land and sea. This system would have created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. A good harvest proved the gods were pleased, which reinforced the priest's power, which in turn filled the temple stores, further cementing their control over the population. Without any deciphered records, we are left staring at these silent stone chambers, wondering if we are seeing a church, a bank, or both. The true purpose of these spaces may be forever beyond our grasp, a reminder that for some ancient peoples, the most practical act of survival was also a form of worship. The architectural DNA of the Roman Horria did not vanish with the empire. It found a new patron in the medieval church, whose sprawling tithe barns rose like wooden cathedrals across the European countryside. These were the horrea of their age, built to hold the 1/10 share of all produce owed to the church by every farmer in the parish. With their soaring timber frames and vast, nave-like interiors, they were engineered for the same eternal challenges: ventilation to keep the grain dry and immense strength to hold the weight of a community's survival. The stone foundations and thick walls were a direct inheritance from ancient models, a physical continuation of the same need to centralize and control the food supply. This lineage did not end in the Middle Ages. The Industrial Revolution simply recast the same problem on a colossal new scale. The great grain elevators that appeared along the railways of the American Midwest were the tithe barns reimagined in steel and concrete. They were machines for storage, using conveyor belts and gravity to fight the same old enemies, moisture and pests. Today, the physical silo is just one node in a global, digital network. The clay tablet has been replaced by the blockchain ledger, and the official's seal by a digital certificate of authenticity. Yet the core mission is astonishingly familiar. We are still building systems to prevent spoilage, ensure security, and manage the mind-boggling logistics of moving food from the field to the city. The scale is global and the speed is instantaneous, but the fundamental problem of feeding dense urban populations is a constant in human history. Our modern world, with its just-in-time delivery and commodity markets, does not stand apart from antiquity. It is the latest iteration of a 10,000-year-old experiment, built directly upon the ancient, unshakable foundation of the granary. Across the vast emptiness of the desert, the caravanserai rose like a man-made island. These were not the permanent, state-run granaries of settled empires, but something more fluid and adaptable. A caravanserai was a fortress, an inn, and a warehouse all in one, a vital node in the sprawling network of the Silk Road. A merchant, after weeks of travel with his train of heavily laden camels, would see its walls as a promise of survival. Inside, he would find not just safety from bandits and the elements, but a secure courtyard where his goods could be stored temporarily. His bales of silk, sacks of spices, and precious metals were sheltered behind massive gates that were locked each night. This was a mobile, decentralized warehouse system stretched across thousands of miles. The real mystery, however, was not in the thick walls, but in the invisible systems of trust that operated within them. How could a Persian merchant leave a portion of his goods in a caravanserai in Samarkand, trusting they would be safe until his return journey, or that a trading partner he had never met would honor a deal made through intermediaries? This was a world that ran on credit and reputation long before formal banking. A merchant's word was his bond, and his ability to secure future trade depended entirely on his record of honesty. These hubs were melting pots of cultures, languages, and religions, yet they functioned on a shared understanding of commercial law and mutual self-interest. Security was a collective responsibility. The caravanserai's keeper was a figure of immense authority, often appointed by the local ruler, and he was responsible for the safety of all guests and their property. The penalty for theft within these walls was severe and immediate, a necessary deterrent in a place where so much portable wealth was concentrated. but accountability went deeper. Goods were sealed with familiar clay bulli, and transactions were recorded in multiple languages on scraps of parchment or in personal ledgers. A Chinese porcelain vase might change hands from a Sogdian trader to a Byzantine merchant based on a handshake and a promise backed by nothing more than the fear of being blacklisted from the entire network. This informal, reputation-based system was the true engine of ancient globalization. It moved more than just silk and spices. It moved ideas, technologies, and cultures across continents, all powered by the simple, profound need to store things safely along the way. The silent testimony of an ancient granary is not found in grand inscriptions, but in the dust underfoot. To reconstruct these vast warehouse networks, archaeologists become detectives of the microscopic, sifting through millennia of soil for clues invisible to the naked eye. One of their most powerful tools is the analysis of phytoliths, microscopic silica bodies that form in plant tissues. When a grain of wheat or barley decays, its organic matter vanishes, but its unique, durable phytolith signature remains in the soil for thousands of years. By taking soil samples from the floor of a suspected storage room and analyzing them under a microscope, scientists can confirm the presence of specific crops. Finding a dense concentration of barley phytoliths in a single chamber is like finding a ghostly fingerprint of the harvest that once filled it. This silent evidence can distinguish a granary from a barracks or a workshop, turning an empty space into a confirmed larder. Another puzzle is pieced together literally, fragment by fragment. Across ancient sites, archaeologists find countless broken lumps of baked clay, the shattered remains of the seals that once secured sacks and jars. The painstaking work of reassembling these fragments is a form of historical networking. When a seal impression is reconstructed, its unique design can be traced. A single seal might be found in a rural farmstead, a riverside dock, and a central city granary. This trail maps an entire administrative circuit, revealing the journey of a single official or the reach of a specific merchant house across the landscape. It connects dots on a map, transforming isolated buildings into parts of a living, breathing supply chain. The very architecture of a ruin tells its own story. A building identified as a potential granary is examined for a specific set of physical traits. Exceptionally thick walls suggest a need for stable, cool temperatures to preserve contents. A raised floor, evidenced by the foundations for pillars or a hypocaust system, points to a design for ventilation. A wide, robust entranceway, perhaps with a ramp, signals a need for easy loading and unloading of heavy goods. The discovery of dozens of identical, standardized storage jars, all of the same volume, is the final telling clue. This was not a home for people, but a warehouse designed for efficiency and control. This detective work blends hard science with historical interpretation. Each soil sample, each reconstructed seal, each architectural measurement is a scattered clue. When woven together, they form a coherent narrative of how a city fed itself. Understanding this meticulous process does more than just confirm a theory. It deepens our appreciation for the evidence itself. It connects us to the everyday reality of the ancient worker who swept that floor, the scribe who pressed that seal, and the countless lives that depended on the abundance held within those silent, sturdy walls. Behind every sealed jar and recorded tablet was a person whose hands made the system real. The granary complex was a world in miniature, a strict hierarchy of laborers, guards, scribes, and overseers, each with a role as specific as a part in a machine. At the very bottom were the haulers, often enslaved workers or conscripted laborers. Their day began before sunrise, their world defined by the staggering weight of the sacks they carried. They moved in a constant, dusty procession, their muscles straining under the load, their sandals scuffing against stone floors worn smooth by countless footsteps. Their hope was simple: to survive the day and receive their meager grain ration, the wage that meant their family would eat. One level above them stood the guards posted at gates and along high walls. Theirs was a monotonous yet tense vigil, a test of endurance against boredom and the constant temptation of the wealth they protected. A guard who failed in his duty faced not just dismissal but execution, for his was a sin against the entire city. Then came the scribes, the literate class who wielded the power of the written word. Perched on stools in small, shaded offices, they tracked the endless flow of commodities. A single mistake in their ledgers could throw the entire accounting into chaos, implicating them in a crime they did not commit. Their hope was for accuracy and favor, a path to a slightly more comfortable life, perhaps even a minor administrative post for their son. At the top of this pyramid was the overseer, a high-ranking official who answered directly to the king or temple. He was the master of this domain, a manager responsible for everything from the structural integrity of the silos to the honesty of his staff. His fear was not a missed meal, but a missed shipment, a spoilage event, or an audit that revealed a discrepancy he could not explain. His success meant prestige and power. His failure could mean ruin. These people did not see themselves as building civilization. They were simply doing their jobs, navigating the social ladder, and trying to secure a better future for their children. Yet it was their collective effort, this immense, silent collaboration across social strata, that turned the granary from a building into a beating heart. The true monument is not the stone they built with, but the society they built through their daily, anonymous toil. Deep within the sealed tomb of the boy King Tutankhamun, amidst the golden masks and jeweled daggers, sat objects of a far more humble nature. These were not treasures for display, but miniature worlds carved from wood, meticulous models of granaries and baking workshops. Inside these tiny buildings, frozen in time, are figures of scribes recording accounts and laborers milling grain. Their presence in a pharaoh's burial chamber seems almost out of place until you understand the profound symbolism. For an Egyptian king, the authority to command the production and distribution of food was not merely an administrative task, it was a divine responsibility. By placing these models in his tomb, Tutankhamun was ensuring he could perform this sacred duty for all eternity. The magic was in the representation, the belief that the model could become a real, functioning source of abundance in the afterlife. It guaranteed the king would never know hunger, but it also proclaimed his eternal right to rule. His power in the next world was predicated on the same control that defined his power in this one, the control over the grain that fed civilization. This funerary practice wove political authority, daily sustenance, and cosmic order into a single, unbreakable thread. The pharaoh was the guarantor of Mot, the fundamental order of the universe, and nothing was more fundamental than ensuring his people and his own eternal soul were fed. The silent, miniature laborers in the dark of the tomb were as vital to the king's journey as any spell or amulet. They were a promise that the system would continue forever. High in the Andes, the Inca engineered a solution to the same ancient problem, but on a vertical scale. Their empire was a tapestry of steep valleys and towering peaks, a landscape where moving armies and feeding laborers seemed an impossible task. Their answer was the Qulqar, a network of thousands of storehouses strung along the spine of their mountain roads. These circular stone buildings, perched on high, windy slopes, were strategically placed a day's march apart. Their location was a stroke of genius. The cold, thin air at high altitude acted as a natural refrigerator, preserving the state's wealth for years. Inside, they did not just hold grain. One of their most vital stocks was chuño, potatoes that were repeatedly frozen under the night sky and trampled by foot to remove all moisture. This freeze-dried product could be stored for a decade, a lightweight, durable superfood that fueled the Inca army as it marched across the continent. The Quilca system was the physical manifestation of Inca power, a logistical web that allowed a central authority to project its will across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Chinese emperors faced a different kind of challenge, the volatility of the market. Their brilliant innovation was the ever-normal granary. This was not merely a storehouse for emergencies, it was a sophisticated economic tool. The principle was one of dynamic equilibrium. In years of abundant harvest and low prices, the state would purchase grain from farmers, building up the reserves in these granaries. Then, when lean years came and prices began to spike, the state would release its stored grain onto the market at a lower price. This ingenious intervention prevented both the ruin of farmers from rock-bottom prices and the starvation of the urban poor from artificially high ones. It was an early form of economic policy designed to create social stability. The Inca Quilca and the Chinese ever-normal granary never knew of each other's existence, yet they were both answers to the same fundamental question. How does a complex society secure its survival against the unpredictable forces of nature and economics? The Incas built a highway of warehouses to conquer geography, while the Chinese built a buffer of grain to conquer market cycles. One system was designed for military mobility, the other for price stability. This parallel development across vast oceans reveals a profound truth: the need to store food, to manage surplus, and to control its distribution is not an invention of one culture. It is a universal catalyst, a force that repeatedly pushes human societies toward greater organization, bureaucracy, and ultimately, greater complexity. The shape of the container may change, but the contents and the power they represent remain hauntingly familiar. The silent strength of a civilization could become its loudest weakness. When the intricate web of warehouses and records failed, the collapse was not merely economic, it was existential. For the Maya, whose city-states thrived in a delicate tropical environment, a series of prolonged droughts meant that their meticulously maintained reservoirs and granaries slowly emptied. The reservoirs, their own version of a water warehouse, cracked under the sun. The social contract, built on the promise of sustenance from the elite, shattered. We see this in the archaeological record, a sudden halt in the construction of ornate temples, followed by the abandonment of city centers. The people did not just leave, they scattered back into the jungle, their complex society dissolving because the system designed to buffer them against a bad year could not withstand a catastrophic decade. The logistical backbone of their civilization simply broke. In the Roman Empire, the problem was not always a lack of grain, but a corruption of the system that moved it. The annona, the public grain dole that ensured the peace of Rome, became a tool for political favoritism and embezzlement. When administrators siphoned off supplies or when the massive shipment from Egypt was disrupted by piracy or rebellion, the consequences were immediate and violent. The streets of Rome, once pacified by bread, would erupt in riots. The very stability the horrea were built to guarantee was undone by the human frailties of greed and incompetence. An invading army understood this vulnerability perfectly. To capture a kingdom, you did not need to defeat its entire army in the field. You simply needed to seize its granaries. A conqueror could starve a city into submission or, by controlling the food supply, instantly command the loyalty of the surrounding population. The fall of an empire was rarely a single battle. It was more often a slow, grinding famine that followed the destruction of these vital hubs. These networks were the fragile lifelines of civilization. magnificent achievements that were always one drought, one corrupt official, or one siege away from disaster. Their enduring power was matched only by their profound vulnerability, a reminder that the greatest structures we build are often the most delicate. This silent history of granaries and seals leaves us with a profound legacy. Our journey through these ancient warehouse networks reveals a simple, powerful truth. Civilization was not built on grand monuments and epic battles alone, but on the meticulous, unglamorous work of storing grain. The granary, the humble clay seal, and the intricate system of control were the unsung heroes of history. They formed the true foundation upon which every city, empire, and culture could safely rise. From humanity's first plaster-lined pits to the vast Horria of Rome, our quest to secure the next meal has been the primary driver of innovation. It forced us to invent writing for accounting, to master architecture for preservation, and to develop laws for commerce. This need created the very concept of centralized authority and the state itself, forging social organization from the fundamental fear of hunger. When we look at our own complex global supply chains today, with their digital ledgers and container ships, we are not looking at a modern invention. We are witnessing the latest chapter in this 10,000-year-old story. The mysteries of the past, from the silent scripts of the Indus Valley to the scattered seals of Mesopotamia, remind us that the challenges of managing abundance, maintaining control, and ensuring collective survival are enduring human dramas. The container has changed, but the contents of our struggle remain the same.